terms of what's happening in Black households. And what it leads me to believe is that what we're seeing across the board is that we went from not having access. Again, if you kind of just put some perspective on this, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974, which prohibited creditors from discriminating against credit applicants based upon race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, age. This act comes out in 1974. Well, it's 2022. You're only talking about less than 48 years where there's some conversation around credit and credit access. And so we went from basically, and there's a whole host of various things, and I'm going to maybe touch on this with regards to the Economic Social Bill of Rights that Dr. King sends in February of 1968. The reason why this is important is because this idea, this understanding of language around economics in the church begins to taper off as soon as there is a greater conversation in the world about African American integration into access to credit in these. So we went from not having any conversation to having access to credit, then having access to all of this information. So we did have, in the last 20 years, we've had so much information that's out there, so much access of at least a faux access to financial vehicles, that it's where do you start? So now we have what's called a choice overload problem. We have all of this information at our disposal, and it's so much that it actually causes, I think, almost a freezing, if you will, to engage, because it's where do we start the conversation? How do we engage in this dialogue? Because there's so much history that comes along with it, but it's also how do you, now that we have all of this information, what do we do with it? How do we parse it? How do we plan to engage it? What do we do to ensure that we are doing the right things alongside of, now that we have this access, now that we have this information? How do we have a healthy dialogue around these various topics? Because there are so many of them to address.
I just never, when you're saying it, it's making perfect sense, because I know I do a lot of work with voter engagement and all that. And you've got all these sites, with voter, there's so much on those sites that I don't even lead people to them anymore because they just shut down. I never thought of that being an issue when it comes to talking about finances. I never thought of that. So I have some statistics of clergy persons. And if anyone who's listening, if you want to ask Reverend Lomax a question, we're doing the question and answer thing. So just put it in the question and answer thing and we'll get to you. Okay, but I have some statistics. So 54% of the clergy, this is a Pew research, 54% of the clergy interviewed said their salaries and other compensation from their church do not provide strong enough financial base for their families. 54%. 49% said it's difficult to provide the same standard of living for their children as most of their peers. So they're comparing themselves. One of the things I always encourage my friends to do is to concentrate not only on the mega churches, but on these little churches and mid-sized churches that, kind of go unnoticed. And these pastors say it's difficult to provide the same standard of living for their children as most of their peers. And everybody wants to be equal. It's the same thing we went through when we were in school. 46% of them said that they are unable to save on a regular basis, and that bothers them. Have you had conversations with people around any of these statistical statements?
Absolutely. And again, the issue with savings and the ability to sustain themselves has to do with, again, access to opportunities, access to and if you're talking specifically about persons who are in the pastoral space, as opposed to their clergy. So I think there's two different discussions. One is pastors, and then there's the persons in the pews, but they face similar issues, and that is the ability to save and put things to the side. And that's been the biggest issue, is the ability to your point, the comparative of being able to spend without concern, without limit, without being able to look at what other persons have and try to live up to a certain standard. There's a lot of comparative realities that end up informing how people manage their own financial wellness. And again, I come back to this idea of all of the financial noise that's out there, persons desiring to want to invest or save, or trying to figure out a path or a pattern, if you will, as to how do I do all of this. And so what often takes place is money is deployed for things that show immediate gratification, or begin to create lifestyle investments, as opposed to the things that are ultimately going to help them sustain their lives. So they do short-term gratification over long-term status, things that are going to sustain them. And so what ends up happening for a lot of as you think about what is creating impact, is the inability to manage the monthly bills, or just looking at what's happening on the monthly basis, and as opposed to looking at the long term. It starts with being able to be very focused on what's happening in the short term. I'll give you an example of someone who I worked with. It was a very simple example, but it was a woman at a church that I was working with in Atlanta. She came into one of the branches that I was at, and she was having an issue with being able to maintain her condo payment. It was getting behind. And she was trying to figure out how to offset all of these dollars that she was losing. And it turned out that the issue was she wasn't opening her bills. She wasn't sitting down and looking at what her fixed expenses were, and she wasn't managing what her discretionary expenses were. And so there were certain things she liked versus what she needed. And there's a hard talk that has to be held with regards to what do you actually have versus the actions that you need to take. And that's a significant issue that we have to pause to really appreciate what are the actual realities of your financial situation versus what action steps you need to actually take. And so oftentimes, to your point, as I'm talking to different persons, I can see the desire for the lifestyle, the reality of them being able to meet their needs, and then the behavior and the discipline that it takes to actually sit down and create an ecosystem that's going to help them be able to create a sustainable life.
So it seems, so once you get into the cycle of, saving and, doing like an inventory of your finances on a monthly basis, it seems like silly that you never did. But I'm going to be real honest. When I was a pastor of a church, I never did that. I was a single mom. I had 2 little kids. They were in daycare. I was worried about a couple of things I never wanted, because I lived in a neighborhood where I saw people being evicted sometimes, and cars being taken away. So I made sure that I always paid my car note on time and my house note on time. But and I made sure that the church's bills were paid, because I didn't want the church to be shut down. But I never, ever, ever, ever sat down and saved. I always thought, this is that theology of scarcity, I think, that we live with. As you're talking, I'm thinking about how when people don't have something and then they get it. So some people, they don't have any money at all, and you give them $500. They're like, oh, I got money. And it's nothing. But because they've not had anything, they squander and they don't know what to do with it. And I think that may be the situation with a lot of people, that it's just they've never had conversations about it, and they don't believe that they can be all right by putting 10% aside, and they just spend, and they spend themselves into ruination. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think, but again, that's part and parcel, a part of the America. If you think about kind of the larger conversation that we're in, we have a billion-dollar industry on just subscription-based economy, in which people can, spend millions. I think I saw something like Netflix has 270 million subscribers on people's smartphones. So you can sign up this, people can purchase Netflix immediately, and they've got 270 million subscribers paying $19, $20 a month. The ease of being able to have access to entertainment, access to different things, causes persons to put money in the things that they can give immediate gratification, give immediate, as opposed to delaying that for something down the line. And so again, to your point, saving becomes secondary. It becomes something that's difficult to perceive, but it's amazing what can happen if you're disciplined and can provide some sense of consistency. There's a concept in investing called dollar cost averaging, which just simply says if you put a certain amount away each month, over time, you will begin to see money grow as you're investing in. It has to do with stocks, but if you invest consistently over time, you'll outperform trying to pick a stock or pick something big, trying to swing for the fences and make a lot of money. If you're just consistent with the concept is, if you're consistent over time, you'll outperform any type of gimmick, any type of attempt to try to offset the system. And so again, that's a really big concept, is the ability to just save, the ability to put money to the side. And again, start with small dollar amounts, start with goals. And I would say the thing that I would tell you is, and would advise, is the conversation needs to be about very tangible goals. What are you saving for in particular? If you don't have a goal that you're attaching to the savings, it makes it a lot more difficult just to save. So again, you have to have some emotional tie to why you're saving, so it can help you continue to push forward towards that and sacrifice against that which you might ultimately be trying to ascertain or to save for.
So let me push you a little bit, because when you hear people who are savvy in this financial stuff, you think, oh, you've always had it together. I ain't trying to talk to you. So, but can you share just a little bit of your journey of where you were financially and how you made the transition from where you were to where you are now? What kind of happened in your life that gave you a sense of the importance of doing the work that you do now?
Yeah, well, a couple of things have happened. Over my journey I'll start with my first job, and as in the bank as a teller. I watched persons walk in and talk with a woman that was sitting across from me. Her name was Judy, and they would go and set this appointment with her, and she would give them advice, and then she would bring me whatever the transaction was, and then they would walk out. And I asked her, "What do you do?" And she said, "Well, people don't always know what to do with their money. And so what I do is I give them ideas on ways that they can further save and help move closer to their goals for their families and for their dreams. And that totally blew my mind because I had never been in a conversation and my family where we talked openly about what was happening financially. And so I noticed that as I watched other cultures, they moved differently. They had different conversations. They were open to getting advice and allowing persons to understand where they were financially, what they needed to do, and how to ultimately make the best decisions for them and their family. And so that was what always became a part of my DNA, is seeking out more information, reading, learning, talking to persons, and being able to say, hey, I don't understand this concept. Can you explain it to me? And then ultimately continuing to do that work in various constructs. So from that point to being in banking, and then going in and then being on in a church and teaching a money management God's way course, I always had this conversation about the connection between finance and faith and the importance of these connections that we need to make and address. From a personal perspective, I would tell you that it's not always been from, everything was perfect, right? There have been some moments in which I've had to, when I was in seminary and had to figure out life without an income, or and having to figure out, how do you manage debt? I had a family, I had children, wife. We were all in graduate school trying to figure these things out, and we had to figure out how could we reach out to family, reach out to all the resources. We had to create an ecosystem around us, help us sustain, and we got help, and we also got debt, student loans. I mean, we had to, in order for us to, so again, the student loan conversation that's happening on the national level is absolutely a real thing. So between working, debt, and family, we had to create an ecosystem around ourselves to help us sustain ourselves and try to figure out what are the different options that we have to be able to help ourselves while we're going through these different challenges. The other piece is that once we got income back after years of study and the like, was being very transparent about where we were, where we are, and what we need to do as a unit. Given that I'm married, as a unit. For those who aren't married, it's still the same concept. It's about creating an ecosystem around you to be able to talk to persons who can help you think through your financial situation and not hide it. I think we have a lot of persons who suffer in silence about what's going on with them financially. And that is the worst thing we can do, is to be suffering in silence as if we're the only ones going through this, as if we're the only ones that have faced a trial financially. And it's about getting that information out, getting to some persons that you can trust, and some organizations that you can trust that are doing this work to help persons be able to create some financial confidence, to be able to create financial opportunity. And so I think that's the key. Is the journey for me has always been the being honest about where you are, and then getting the help and creating the systems and the persons around you that can help you with where you are. That's been really key for me personally, and what I've seen other cultures do to help create sustainability for themselves and financial confidence.
So do we as Black people, do we need some help doing that ecosystem thing? I mean,
yeah, I think that's exactly the point. This is part of the ecosystem. This conversation actually is part of the ecosystem, but there are so many brilliant Black financial professionals that are in this business and can be tapped into. They're in our congregations. They are persons in our congregations. There are persons who are there was a conversation. I got to give credit to Dr. Martha Simmons. She had a conversation on Facebook Live the other day with three talented women who are CFP, Certified Financial Planners. And if you didn't see that, I'd go on to Facebook Live, Facebook, and check that out, in which they're having conversations. But these conversations are happening, and there are persons who can help and are very knowledgeable and want to be a part of the solution. That's why I'm on in this conversation right now, that we're saying enough. Let's be a part of the conversation. Let's get into the weeds of what's happening. And it starts with generic conversations. It starts with general conversations like this, like what can we do? But then the real work is on the ground. It's the specifics. It is not in the generic. It is in the specifics of what's happening in a person's life that's going to ultimately be the differentiator from a financial perspective.
Do you, and you're right, that it's the specifics, and you're absolutely right, where clergy persons and their congregations do not want to talk about it. 41% of clergy persons in that same survey I referred to said that unexpected financial demands create financial turmoil in your life. And even if you have financial, I don't know about you, but in my life, when there's been financial turmoil, I can't do much else because I'm worried about it all the time. If you're in a place where the bill collectors, and we have a lot of people now who are paying back student loans, which is another part of this conversation. But these denominations require that people go to seminary, get these educations, and then they get out and they get these churches that don't pay them or can't pay them. So now they have their altruistic, view of, I'm going to just, do Jesus's work, but I can't do it because I don't have no money. And people are calling me, I can't sleep at night. Do you find that people are still pretty, congregations even don't want to talk about it, or clergy, they just don't want to talk about it? So the work that you're doing maybe is a little bit more difficult because of that resistance?
Yeah, so I think you hit a nerve here, which is an important one, and that is, again, seminary in debt, right? And one of the things that I think seminaries we have to challenge seminaries with are conversations like this on the front end, and when in terms of what is parish life like, and what is the true cost of seminary, and are you going to be able to be full-time in your pastoral ministry, or will you be bivocational? And what would it require for you to be bivocational? I'll share some additional statistics that I thought were pretty interesting. Pew Research back in 2022 said that about 1 in 7 Black adults work more than one job, with most so doing it to meet basic needs. And so we understand that that's what's happening in the larger construct of Black America. If you then whittle that down into churches and pastors and seminary expense, we know that that's also a factor of what's happening with regards to pastorates and persons who've taken this awesome call and taken it to the place where they want to get additional study or training through seminary. And I think the issue that we face in this reality is like myself, when I went through seminary, no one was, I believed God was going to open a door, and I was going to be, there was going to be churches waiting for me that were going to be able to fulfill the debt obligation I just took on, navigating 3 years of seminary. The truth of the matter is that I think the conversation about what it costs versus what the reality is on the other side needs to be brought to the floor. It comes to and it's not to say that God didn't call all of these wonderful pastors. It does not mean that seminary is not invaluable. It is. What it does mean is that as you're having a conversation about your call, that you have the full consideration in front of you so that you can faithfully make good choices, even on borrowing. Maybe you're not borrowing as much on the front end and you're working through seminary. Maybe it's not 3 years. Maybe you take 6 years, or you're doing a part-time program, or you're thinking differently about it so that you can make the right decision that makes the best fiscal and financial sense for you and your family. And so again, having those kind of conversations is extremely, extremely important. Let me say this, because it's a lot of information, but I gotta say this. So I've been in wealth management I was in wealth management and an EVP, division executive in a Fortune 500 company for wealth management, in which the minimum entry point for persons inside of this particular group is $2 million in net worth, and which means that they own $2 million in liquidity and assets. I mean, the only reason why this is important, because the way in which the financial institution that I worked for at the time set people up for success is they had 7 advisors plus their own 2, which would be a client advisor and an attorney and an accountant. But all of those persons in that group had 9 advisors that helped to advise them on matters of insurance, credit, investments, financial planning, accounting, legal, trust, legacy planning, and I'm probably missing 1 or 2, but just in my mind. And there was a client advisor who was kind of the quarterback, and a client support specialist was the person who actually did the actual banking. What I recognized in leading this group, that we had these persons would sit around and just think about these clients and how to help them with regards to their credit, with regards to their finances, with regards to their cash flow and their investments, and making sure they weren't overweighted in certain investments. It's only relevant to this conversation with regards to pastors and their finances, that if persons with $2 million in net worth need that kind of guidance, how much more shouldn't persons who have less need that kind of guidance, that kind of ecosystem to help them? And what I'm simply suggesting is that at the beginning of the journey, as persons are entering in to seminary and they're having conversations with their mentors, with their senior pastors, with persons who are guiding them, great, you were ordained by them, but did they pass along the nuggets of what they've learned from their journey financially after having gone through seminary, and what specifically it's going to require, and what that first church salary might look like, and all of those different things that can help persons to be able to faithfully fulfill their call. There's also, and I'll say this, that dialogue is critical on the beginning of the conversation, not at the end, not when you're coming out, but at the beginning of the conversation. If you know what's actual, you can take the right action. You're going to hear me say that a million times. If you know what's actual, you can take the right action. Like opening a bill, right? Anything else, if you read the fine print, you can understand what's really going to happen. Now, here's what I'm going to say. God can do anything. I believe that. I believe that God can blow our minds and open up doors and windows from heaven and pour you out a blessing that you will not have room enough to receive. I believe that wholeheartedly. I believe God can make a way out of no way. I believe that. I have lived that. I have seen that. And I have also seen that we have a responsibility to understand as much as we can so that we can do the best we can with the resources we have when we have them. And when that happens, when that combination happens, man, it's awesome when God does what God does. But until God does it, we got to have a plan that is real and that is connected to the reality of what we're seeing. Yes, God can do things that we cannot even imagine. But simultaneously, until that happens, we have to have a realistic understanding of what the possibilities are. Every pastor, every person who's leaving seminary is not going to get $100,000 salary,
Sure
or
not.
$60,000 salary, or $40,000 salary. And if that's the case, then you have to tell them that, especially if they're going to take on $100,000 worth of debt
Right.
to become a pastor. So we have to start having these real conversations. Yes, I hope that everybody gets student loan forgiveness. I hope that that works out for everyone. But even student loan forgiveness, let's just keep it all the way real, says you have to have worked for 10 years and have made 10 years worth of payments. So here's the irony, right? If you've taken all this debt load and you don't have the salary because of what you come out with after seminary, because you're it's your first church, and you're trying to build some, I mean, you're not going to come out, I'll just put it this way. You're not going to come out of seminary and replace Dr. Butts.
No,
That's not going to happen.
not gonna happen.
You're not even going to come close.
No.
So the reality of that mentorship and being able to explain what happens without creating fear or without creating, but encouraging them to understand what the realities are and what the economic impact is to them, so that they're at least seeing it in full view.
You make me wonder I've heard this kind of shared by different people recently, that financial literacy ought to be a part of the seminary education. That, you learn exegesis and you learn ethics and you learn Hebrew and Greek, and you really need to learn financial literacy. Do you believe that? Do you agree with that?
I agree with that 100%. In fact, that's what I'm working on now, is beginning the dialogue to help with that. There are a lot of great people doing a lot of great work around this. But I want to add my 2 cents to the dialogue. I think it's absolutely right. The seminaries do owe it to those students to talk about financial literacy for them as individuals, but also for them as they're inheriting businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the other piece of this. The church has a business side to it. And if you don't understand the business side to the church, it can also lead to cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain parts of being a pastor that you have to understand financially. And you have to understand what that requires of you. You have to understand, seasons, cyclical, cash flow. You do need to understand cash flow. You do need to understand, how financial decisions are made. And so it's not just financial literacy for the individual, it's business acumen or business reading financial statements,
Right.
and understanding what that means from a perspective of helping your church become also a sustaining force in the community that you serve.
And I know there's a lot of pushback, or at least there was when I was with my church, a lot of pushback when I would say church is a business. They said, "Oh, now see," they would, tell me that I was not being true to Jesus. The church was not just supposed to do the Lord's work. Well, okay, yeah, but the Lord's work we need money to do that. So there's a pushback against it. And then what happens is, of course, the pastors suffer financially, and so do the members. And then the members who are suffering financially go to the pastors who are also suffering financially. And this is one of the things that used to break my heart all the time. They would come They've never read a financial statement. The Lord's going to provide. They're just going to provide. It's going to be all right. And they come, mama dies. Mama dies. And they come and they say, Reverend Sue, my mama died. We don't have no money. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
what am I supposed to, what do you do with that? And pastors die without money and without estate plans and all of that. And so how do we fix that? How do we get into that and begin to dismantle that?
Yeah, well, it's a big question with a lot of pieces and parts. But I think the first part is the talk, right? We have to begin to be comfortable with being uncomfortable around finance.
Okay.
We have to be okay with saying, I don't know. I don't know what to do, and seek out persons who can help. Yeah. Seek out persons who can engage in real time around the situations that we're facing. I think part of what we find with with some clerics is that there is a very real need to have the answer, even when you don't have it, and to not want to portray that vulnerability or to expose that vulnerability and say, hey, I'm struggling too. I don't really know what to say. And so there are great groups across the nation that are doing this work. You have to tap into the local ecosystem to be able to help. I'll give you an example, just so this is not just concept. I'm currently on the local board here for an organization called LISC, Local Initiatives Supports Communities, and they do work specifically with regards to wealth gaps. And they have what's called financial opportunity centers. These financial opportunity centers are nonprofit organizations in the local Richmond, Petersburg area, in which persons can sign up to get help on affordable housing, on credit, on assistance. And so what happens is that if you tap into these resources, these financial opportunity centers, you can get some planning to help you with before the issue becomes the issue. Yeah. When mama dies, it's I don't want to say it's too late, but at that point when you're trying to figure out financial resources and how to make things happen, the best we have in those moments to a large extent is communal economics. It's trying to see who can do what, who can add something to the pot, and you're kind of reaching to hopefully help, through the church raise funds, or the pastor or persons coming together and seeing what they can do to help that particular family, because it's all hands on deck, and it's like a fire. As you're trying to put it out as fast as possible with least amount of damage. But prior to that, there are systems, groups, and communities that can help persons think through these eventualities. We all know at some point we are going to die. Mm-hmm. And we have to say, I think part of our language around death is also an issue, is that we don't like to talk about death. It is going to happen. As God is my witness, it is going to happen.
Right.
Yes. I am going to die.
Yes.
And you are going to die. Every person who is on this call is going to die. We have not seen one person who has not died. So if we can be honest about the fact that we are going to die, again, if we can understand the actual, right, we can take the right action. I think that's what's critical, is we have to say, okay, What are the charts for what are the realities of death?
Right.
What happens when persons die? Well, the body has to go somewhere. I mean, just the steps of it. The body has to go somewhere. It either goes to a morgue or goes to a funeral home.
That's right.
In the funeral home, there's going to be you're going to get all these choices and levels of types of services that are going to be offered to you. Are you going to, do you burying the body? What specifically is going to happen with that? Does the mother have assets? Was this planned for? How many children do they have? Are any of the children financially in a position to help with this situation, with this eventuality? These are the talks that have to happen. We've not been comfortable in having these talks, but I believe the pastorate is such an incredible seat to have in our communities, because it is the one seat that we know we can still have a conversation in which a majority of, according to research still, according to what we're learning in statistics, most Black persons in America still consider themselves Christian and still consider themselves a part of the Black local church. It may look different, feel different. Now it's declining. We've seen those statistics as well, but we still know that a majority of Black Americans have some type of affiliation to a church. Given that that's the case, that means the pastor still has the ear, and we have to start normalizing the conversation around finance. It is a culture around, the culture of silence can be broken, but it starts with us, again, becoming more in tune with these concepts of finance, having conversations about finance, but then also being bold enough to take out time on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Maybe thinking differently about the sermonic moment and saying, we're just going to have a conversation, maybe inviting some experts into the pulpit, some local financial planners, some local persons who have the insight, and say, we're going to have a different dialogue. I'm going to interview this person. And they can set it up with a scripture. They can still say, what they need to say, but I think that's the way in which we have to change this dialogue to begin to give the language, give the support to our pastors and to our parishioners, so we can have real conversations about what actually happens when you die. Not talking about going to heaven.
Right.
We understand.
Right.
Those who believe in Jesus, we understand that. What we're talking about is when you die.
Right.
We understand your soul is going to be, we get that. That's
We already got it.
We understand it. We talking about you, what happens to your family?
Yes.
What does your family have to deal with? Yeah. What is the reality of just getting you to the funeral and burying you? What are those steps?
Right. Right.
And then what does that cost?
That's right.
Realistically.
Right.
And okay, do you have anything set aside
right
for that to happen?
They do not. Most of them do not.
And if we do not, then can we start to create, talking about these ecosystems, can we begin to think about how we create ecosystems that help others to walk through this?
It's so,
nobody wants to
talk about it. Yeah, they don't want to talk about it. It's like it's going to be all right, but it's not going to be. We have some agency that we don't use. I think that, and we don't. we have this idea that we're just supposed, I call it the sit on the dock of the bay type theology. We just gonna sit there and everything God's just gonna do it for. And life doesn't work that way. Spiritual life doesn't work that way. And it's very damaging to us. And, I was talking with somebody a couple of days ago about estate planning. He was saying estate planning is critical because, even if you have a will, if you haven't done that estate planning thing, you can have enough money actually to pay for your funeral. But if you haven't done the estate planning thing, it stays in probate. And we don't talk about that. And so people get jacked up. And I can remember one person came to me when I was at my church and didn't have any money to bury his mama. And he said, what am I going to do? I said, well, we're going to have to, like you said, try to find somebody to take care of it, because he wanted it big. He wanted the most expensive casket and the limousine, and he wanted what it looked like. He didn't want it. I felt like it was more for him than for his mom. I don't know, but anyway, we had to talk about what that cost. But I said, do you understand though that they will not bury your mom until you give them some money? Do you?
Yeah.
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
oh, they won't get rid. Oh, yeah, they will. They will hold your mama. They will hold your
right.
mama. So you need to understand that. Anyway, we have a couple of questions. We have a question. What can those churches that are micro churches, those that are less than 100 members, less than $50,000 budgets, do to maintain financial health context that can support the mission of the ministry? What can they do? These little.
I love that question, because I think that's more the reality of our churches in America than what we see across the board. There's a lot of micro. I don't know that I would want to call them micro churches.
Yes, I think they're more those churches than the
small.
Others.
They're small, but I would say so. A couple of things. Again, the question becomes, so if we're talking about how do we sustain that ministry or that for their mission in particular, separate from the conversation we were just having with mom with burying a person who's passed away. We're talking about sustaining the operation of a church that has less than a $50,000 budget. The first question is, what is impact? Have you defined what true impact in ministry is?
Right.
And then be able to decide and discern, how do we faithfully fulfill that with this budget? Because oftentimes the issue with a $50,000 budget isn't that it's a $50,000 budget. The issue is that the congregation and or the pastor has not been honest about what's actual and then take the right action. What might have to happen with that $50,000 budget is that some of the ways in which we're thinking about our programmatic side of the ministry, some of the things that we might have historically done in the ministry, they may need to be thought differently. There may have to be a different expression. I don't think it's very different from a $50,000 or $50,000 salary, or $40,000 salary, or $30,000 salary. You make your, and we'll come back to budgeting here. What's the key to budgeting? The key to budgeting in any budget is to ask two very important questions. What are your fixed expenses?
Mm-hmm.
And what are your discretionary expenses? And in the church, sometimes because we want to remain faithful, we think everything is fixed or we're not faithful.
Right.
What oftentimes needs to happen is that we need to pause and to ask the bigger question, which of these expenses are fixed? Which of these are discretionary? And then be able to separate very clearly, is there a way for us to think differently about the discretionary expenses in such a way that we can still be faithful to the mission of the church until a new opening, a new opportunity, or a new some additional resources might come. It's not the budget. Let me be very clear. It's not the budget. It's the mindset.
Mm.
It's the mindset around how you see that budget, and being able to say, okay, if this is what we have, how do we use what we have to still remain faithful and fruitful? But those are tough conversations. Again, it comes back to the talk.
You know,
Am
you
I
could
willing to have?
about that. You should write a book on
Am I willing to have the talk? Talk about what's actual versus what the right action is. Have I said we have a $50,000 budget, but we plan as if we have a $200,000 budget or a $100,000 budget? Are all of the, and without knowing specifically the churches, it's difficult to do this in a conversation like this. The first thing I would be asking is how many of the expenses tied to this $50,000 budget are fixed?
Yeah.
Simultaneously, the other piece is we understand that salaries are a large part of a budget. Again, coming back to seminary and helping with the mindset of the pastor, are you willing to be bivocational? And so what that means though is, listen, church that where we have a $50,000 budget, if I'm bivocational, then we have to be clear on timeshare and commitment because of capacity, right? I'm going to give you all I got when I can, but I have to be able to negotiate that in order for me to sustain my family and be able to sustain the things that are important to me. I'm going to need to take this on because of the reality of the expenses of the church, or the reality of the budget of the church and the cash flow and the inflows of what's happening. The other piece that I would say is it's not just about 50. This is the other thing that I think that we miss, and this is a nugget that I just want to, it's not just about $50,000. It's about, do you understand your actual cash flow when you receive that money? It's not just how much money you receive. It's about, can you match when you receive the money to when expenses are due, when things are happening in the life of the church? Sometimes it's not that it's not just the budget. It's about the fact that when you actually need to write that check versus when the inflows of cash come in order for you to be able to meet that obligation. And so there's this very interesting and important dialogue that has to happen between not just fixed and discretionary, but cyclical cash flows that allow us to understand, okay, well, when does the money come in? Well, when are our programs? When do we write these checks to the convention? When do we write these checks to the missions? When do we do these activities that make us feel faithful in our context to the ministry that we're doing? Maybe if we see historically that our cash flow is tight over the summer, which most churches it is, then maybe we need to rethink some of the ministerial efforts that we are presenting in certain parts of the year. And again, that's just a conversation of actual action. It's saying, it's not, doesn't mean that you're not being faithful, you're not going to pray over it. I'm not dismissing any of the religious fervor that we have, that God will make a way. What I am saying is, God has made a way by allowing you to look back at previous years of financial statements. And if you look at the past years, it can give you indication of what may potentially be happening in the future, so that you can have responsible conversations with your congregation and begin to have the dialogue that's necessary to help you be the best steward you can be over the resources that God has given.
Do you think that, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about how education is the key for everything. We think we know something when we don't, and actually, the internet and Google, you can find out any information. It lets you know how much you don't know. Do you think that clergy maybe have been guilty, I don't know if that's the right word, of believing that they can just do all things? Does that make sense? It's like, I know this and I know that. I'm a pastor, I can do all of this, and without having the education around all these different areas of stuff that they're hit with as a pastor, just kind of go through it blindly. Do you think that's an issue, and does that contribute to some of the financial turmoil that clergy go through?
I would say that there is a faultiness. Now, I wouldn't call it faultiness. I would say that there is always a struggle with knowing you're responsible for the care of people, remaining faithful to your call in ministry, having conversations with God, and being faithful in what you present, and showing vulnerability. Because you're looked to for strength and for hope and for optimism and for insight. And so, as a pastor and as one who understands fully the burden and blessing of that seat, there's a desire to want to give hope and to provide a sense of victory, even if you're in a valley, personally. And so the ability to be vulnerable is probably one of the most difficult things, because we're also trained in seminary, or at least where we're told not to bleed on the folk. And so there is this wall that we place, an unhealthy one, I think, to a certain extent, or it can be. And the opposite is difficult too, the pendulum of where you see people, just saying everything, so the question is, how do you navigate that? How do you navigate the space of having a pastor's heart to give insight and hope and optimism and clarity and a path and a vision and a place that we're headed, and yet instill pause and be vulnerable and say, we're going to need some help in this area. And I think we have to give pastors space to be honest and to be earnest, and to create these kind of dialogues to say, hey, I need to talk through this. I need some help. Just like, and I would say that it's no different than what we've seen as of late with more conversation around mental health.
Yeah.
We've started to become more and more comfortable with talking about the fact that we need mental health in the Black church. We need to have, persons need therapy. I think if you are a Black person in America and you've made it through COVID and you've made it through all this stuff that we've gone through, I think we all need therapy. But I also think we need financial therapists. We need persons who can hear what we're going through, not necessarily pass judgment, but hold us accountable and then help us on the path. And I don't think pastors we've provided those hush harbors for spaces of finance. We have not provided those spaces. And that's what we must do. We must provide, we must normalize this conversation. This should not be a new conversation for Black people in America in 2022, but yet, and for Black churches in 2022. The fact that we're having this conversation in 2022 and that it's a topic tells you how far we have to go, but also how much we need to normalize these conversations and provide safe spaces for clergy persons to be able to discuss this reality.
Yeah. So I have two last questions. First, tell everybody who's listening how you came up with the title for this talk, because I loved it.
Cheering, don't fumble the bag. It's coming out of really, I'm a hip hop child. I'm a child of the hip hop era. I grew up in the 80s with Run DMC and the like. And so I keep my ear to hip hop. I'm always going to be a fan of hip hop, not always a fan of every lyric, but a fan of the creativity and the genius of this music that has literally changed the culture of America, or influenced the culture of America. There's a lot that hasn't changed, but it's definitely influenced the culture of America. But there's a lot of emphasis in hip hop and in the world about chasing the bag. And the bag represents wealth and success and prosperity. And so the idea of fumbling the bag is really the conversation about why are we fumbling? What is happening in our churches, in our communities, that's allowing the resources of our community not to transfer. There's over $1 trillion in wealth that's going to be transferred in wealth through this, from baby boomers to Gen Xers to millennials, through what we were just talking about with regards to estates. And a lot of that money is going to be going away just simply because we don't understand wealth transfer. We don't understand legacy planning or estate planning. And I give you a quick example. If a family receives a house, mom dies, the house she has is now passed on to the children, and they do not have already set up, they're going to sell this house, and they hold on to it. There's not only the frictional costs, what's called frictional costs. Those are costs that aren't really costs that are connected to the writing of taxes, but there are actual frictional costs for what you have to hold on to. So as an example, if you didn't grow up in the same state as your mother, a lot of Black persons don't live in the same state that their parents grew up in. So mom has a house in another state. The frictional cost of having to go back and forth to that house, settle that estate, is now an expense. That's now, so now what would be an asset or something that would be considered a blessing is now something that is costing the next generation simply because there was no plan for going back and forth. So not only do you have that, you now have the taxes that are tied to the property. If there's any upkeep or anything that you have to put into the house to make it, to be able to sell it, but there's stuff that's, so it's all of this, it's these nuances that we have to think through. But you have all of these assets that are going to be transferred or could potentially be transferred, but that wealth is going to be lost if we're not thinking and having these conversations and really doing our best to try to plan for what could be a great opportunity to salvage some of the wealth transfer that's going to happen in the United States.
You know, the
So
more you,
the bag was about. So back to the question. I apologize on that. The whole point about fumbling the bag is the idea of if we could have better dialogue about these types of topics, we could secure it, not fumble it. If we could start having conversations with pastors and local churches to have dialogue about issues like estate planning, issues like budgeting and what's happening in the local church, what's happening with our parishioners. If we can begin to have those conversations, we can secure it, not fumble it. We can begin to have articulation and begin to invite persons to the table that have this expertise. We can begin to have really great dialogue, and that dialogue can change behavior, and the behavior can then impact people's real, tangible lives. That's the key. It starts with articulation, that then influences behavior. Behavior then moves into real impact and real life change. And so we don't want to fumble it simply because we don't understand it. We want to secure it by getting the insight and the information that we need to help.
you know, the more you talk, the more I realize we could probably do this like once a month because you have so much information. It's so and I don't know how many people are listening, but I'm knowing that whoever is listening is getting some really good advice. It's stuff that we just need to shake off the fear and the reluctance and just, you know, dig into it and because it's going to free us up. I know that I listened to Karen Hunter and Greg Carr, and one thing that Hunter says is she's, you know, she and he quote that the title from Sonia Sanchez's play, How Do It Free Us? How do it free us? How, I just love that. How do it free us? How is the way that we're spending money or not spending money? How, you know, even with you're talking about with the mama died has the house, how do it free us? And I think if we were able to just think like that and apply that question to every single thing that we do, financially, spiritually, but financially, how do it free us? What are we doing to keep ourselves tied up in knots? And if we're tied up in knots, for me, being tied up in knots is like being in debt. We're not free. We're just not free. Right. And so I'm just saying, Reverend Lomax, we could, you know, we might have to talk because you have such great advice and help. One last question, and I know we're close to the end. They say we're heading into a recession. Do you think that that's true? What advice would you give to clergy persons in their congregations that are just not reading the signals, right? Not seeing what's happening?
Yeah. Well, all indicators are that there is some type of recession activity when you start seeing certain things that come along with creating a recession, and interest rates hikes are a part of that. Inflation is part of that. So you saw where consumer price index went up like the highest in 40 years. And you start seeing these types of indicators that give you line of sight on what's happening. It's potentially indicating that a recession is going to happen. What I would tell you is a couple of things that are just tactical strategies. Much as you can save, there's discretionary spending that you're doing, stop it. If you can, so cash will be important. This is not, and what I mean by that is think through, you know, if you're doing Starbucks or if you're doing anything that is consistently discretionary, rethink your pattern. If you're doing K-cups and you got a Keurig, you know, maybe you just do a pot of coffee. You know, I mean, any way that you can think through on scaling down, buying the store brand versus the customizable brand. ways in which you can begin to tighten your belt, not in huge swings where you're, but ways in which you can tighten your belt and start putting money to the side. If you have any credit cards that have debts on them that you can put some extra money towards, I would absolutely have you start trying to pay those off. Obviously, with interest rates rising, what could have been something that you were going to pay off in 12 months, depending upon the interest rate and how high it jumps over this time frame, it could end up pushing that timeline out years. And we're seeing just, if you bought a house 6 months ago, you were paying 3%. Now they're saying mortgage interest rates are 7%. So again, those are all indicators that a recession is happening, but it also means that money is becoming more expensive. It's going to become more expensive to borrow. So anything that you have on a variable rate that's tied to interest rate fluctuation, the more you can get rid of that debt, better off to do it now. Simultaneously, if there's ways for you to put money aside that's discretionary, from discretionary spending to have cash to the side, I would definitely recommend doing that as well, because we don't know how a recession is going to impact jobs. Right. That's the issue. So, and what I would also say is, since we're talking to clerics, the other piece of this that I would just share is that we also don't know how it's going to impact our congregations.
Right.
And so understand, as much as we'd like to say that persons are going to uphold their giving and uphold their commitment to give through a recessionary cycle, there might be some impact to budgets. And if that's the case, then you have to also be prepared for that and how that might impact you as a congregation. So to be thoughtful about that. And again, doesn't mean you're, sounding the alarm and scared, but you're thinking about prudent, tactical measures you can take to go.
So yeah, it's going back to if you know what's actual, you can take the right action.
Correct.
Your words. I love that. Just want to thank you for all that you've done. I'm going to ask you to hang on for a minute after we after we kind of sign off. I want you to hang on, but I want to thank you for being here and giving us such a wealth of information, the things that clergy talk about. We have a question. Can any suggestions be offered on having a difficult conversation regarding salary? Maybe after we're done, we can talk about that because we're kind of coming up this time. But I hope that those of you who are listening, who have been listening, have taken away some nuggets that you can chew on and think about. Reverend Lomax, if they wanted to get in touch with you to ask you questions, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can reach me at pastorwwbc@gmail.com. pastorwwbc@gmail.com. That's Pastor Westwood Baptist Church. So pastorwwbc@gmail.com. I'll be glad to take any questions or dialogue on that, and then we can set up some time to actually sit down and have a conversation. So yeah, just shoot me an email.
I appreciate that, and I'm really serious that I probably want you to come back and just because you have a broad what's the word I'm looking for, a palette of subjects, actual individual topics that you can school us on. And I think that, I know that I feel hungry for it, and I'm sure that other people are feeling hungry for it as well. So I just really want to thank you for being here, being our guest tonight. For those of you who are listening, we hope that you've enjoyed it and you've learned something, as I said. And I just want to remind you that the 2023 Proctor Conference is coming up in February of 2023, February 20th through the 23rd. So if you haven't registered yet, please do get somebody else to register as well. Bring a friend with you. We are celebrating 20 years of life in the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and so you don't want to miss it. And we have at that conference all types of wonderful people like Reverend Lomax, who give Such good education. And that's what we need in order to be faithful to our ministries. So Reverend Lomax, thank you. Don't hang up. I mean, don't go away yet, but everybody else. So I'm bad at this, leave the thingy. But, I don't know how you do this, but I want you to stay on if possible. And everybody else, have a good evening. Take good care.
Absolutely. Thank you.